Thanks, Con. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out tonight, making the time to be with us. I think Con's opening remarks are very important, that the Christadelphians are not in support of particular political persuasions, but we do read the Bible. And we as Christadelphians try hard to let the Bible speak for itself and to tell us what it has to say for itself. And we need to tell you that it has a very important message about where the world's headed with this story of Israel. The focus of our world is actually on Israel. Is it often that you actually see a newspaper or a news broadcast without Israel in it over the last few years? It's become a very central point in our news, and we suggest to you that God is allowing this to be the case. In fact, making it to be the case so that people turn to the Bible and ask the questions. What does this mean? What are we being woken up to? What are we being alerted to? And our suggestion, as I hope to show tonight, is you're being alerted to where we're at in God's plan. He's got a plan for what he's doing with the earth, and he's partway through that plan, and we're about to start on a very dramatic and exciting new chapter of it, a very fearful new chapter in a way. And so let us show you, as a bit of an exploration of what the Bible has to say about this subject of Israel, for your information, so you can see where we're at. Is the alarm about to go off? Are things about to change drastically? First of all, the Jews themselves are an oddity and an amazing thing. A famous gentleman, Mark Twain, wrote this, and he marveled at the Jews. He said, if statistics are right, the Jews consist but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous, dim puff of stardust, lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of. But he is heard of, has always been heard of. He has made a marvellous fight in this world, in all ages, and had done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. He then goes through and he talks about history, and he says, look, you've got these major world empires. He says, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Roman followed. They made a vast noise, and they're gone. Other people have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight night now, or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmity of age, no weakness of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal, but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. So Mark Twain's marvelling at this idea that you can have great nations. I mean, Rome was the greatest empire that the world's ever seen. And while there still exists remnants of it today, it's not like Israel. Israel has actually gone through disasters of a far greater scale and still exists and have a large representation in our newspapers on a daily basis. How can this be? Well, let's delve a little bit more into this story, because we're talking about alarm clock. How can we tell when it's about to go off? Well, this story of Israel is our key. It shows us what's actually happening. Now, there's a reason why Israel stands out from other nations, why it doesn't behave in the same way, why it hasn't been wiped out like other nations, and that is because Bible prophecy says it would be. God said that he would deal with Israel differently from other nations. This quote is very clear to us, and I hope you can see what it's saying here for yourself, where in Jeremiah, God says this, thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and the stars by light for night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar, the Lord of hosts is his name. If those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Them's big words. Basically what it says is, if you can stop the sun, or you can stop the moon, or you can stop the stars, that's how much chance you've got of stopping Israel from being a nation. It's a constant. Now, if that is God's actual promise, we don't stand any chance of getting rid of the nations. Maybe you could destroy the moon. If you're extremely foolish and wanted to end yourselves, you could end the sun. There's no way knowing. You could end the stars. That's beyond the power of man, to end most of those things at all. So what that quote is saying is God has assured the existence of the nation of Israel. That's what Mark Twain marveled about. So the nation of Israel, we're going to see tonight, has gone through some terrible times when other nations would have been wiped out, and they've continued to exist because of that promise. And now they're about to enter into a new stage. We're on run through, and I just want to capture for you in a bit of a nutshell what we're going to look at tonight. Just briefly the story of Israel as the Bible outlines it, as we get towards the time when this clock is running out. Israel's going to actually be destroyed as a nation. They go into diaspora. Now the word diaspora means to be scattered, to be spread out across the world. They went through enormous persecution that any other people, it would have eradicated them. But then there's a promise that they would be regathered, which is miraculous. It's like a nation being brought back from the dead. And then we're going to go into another drama, which is the stage of Armageddon. And all these things are prophesied in the Bible as the stages that we go through with Israel towards this new chapter in the bright future that God has promised. Now, in all of this, don't think that God is doing this because Israel is always a marvelous people. We clearly read in the Bible that at times they're not. And actually, at this time, they're not actually acknowledging God the way they should right now. So, don't think that we're in total support of Israel because they are marvelous supporters of the Bible and supporters of God. But in the future, there's a different description of Israel. And we'll delve into that in this subject of a bright future when the alarm clock has gone off in this very final part of our talk. Let's go back and have a little look at the destruction of the nation itself. Because what was prophesied is because of their misbehavior towards God, God was going to actually bring desolation on the land. And this is a quote from Leviticus. It's fascinating. Leviticus is hundreds of years ago, back in the Old Testament times, and God predicted and said, if you do this, these are the things that will happen. So these are very old prophecies, and it says here in Leviticus, and your enemy which dwelleth therein shall be astonished at it, and will scatter you among the heathen, and I will draw out the sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. So as far back as one of the most earliest books in the Bible, there was descriptions of the nation being scattered to the four winds, to be scattered throughout the rest of the earth by their enemies. Now the Jews thought that was ridiculous. And they built this place here. So that's just a depiction of the city of Jerusalem. And you can see over here this particular platform, which is their Temple Mount, which they were most proud of. Took over one of the Herods over 40 years to build all of that there. And this particular temple that they built there, and this Temple Mount, the walls in here, used some of the largest stones ever used in human construction. And it was thought that that was completely impossible to overthrow because of the sheer size of those stones. So the Jews would have looked at this prophecy and they actually took pride in their temple because they saw that as not only a religious place for the gathering of their nation, but as a defense strategy. And we find in AD 70 that the Romans actually did attack that particular place, and the Jews just did that. They retreated into that temple area thinking that they would be safe. But the prophecy was that they would not be safe. In fact, when Jesus came, he tried to look for some good in the nation of Israel. And when he didn't find it, he gave a damning prediction against the particular nation itself. He said this. He said about this particular temple here. Now, as Jesus was going out of the temple courts and walking away, his disciples came to show him the temple building. And they said, do you see all these things? I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left on another, all will be torn down. We might have to turn some of these passages up if you have a Bible, but that one's in Matthew chapter 24. So the Romans, in AD 70, which is after the time, after the time of Christ had come and gone, actually came and invaded and attacked the city of Jerusalem. The Jews thought they'd be safe, and they locked the city walls. And when the Romans actually broke into the city, they retreated onto that Temple Mount, assuming they would be safe. And yet, the Romans actually broke into that Temple Mount and destroyed that temple. And then they took the Jewish nation, and in fulfillment of that prophecy, they scattered them across all the different nations of the world. They sent them out from that place through Europe, as we'll see in a moment. But you do notice in that quote that it says it's quite specific about the stones, which is epic, because those stones, as we said, are some of the largest in human construction, and it says not one stone will be left upon another. Now, the reason why that occurred was the temple itself had a lot of gold in it, and the Romans threw a torch in, set fire to the temple, the gold melted, went down the cracks in those stones, and the Roman soldiers tore the Temple Mount apart to get those stones out. The only remaining part is a small part on the actual walls itself. So we've got some challenges here. Let me just give this a little shake. Let's see if that'll behave a little better. Back across the Temple Mount here, we'll just go back a slide. This particular wall, one of these walls around the bottom, can't seem to use laser pointer here, is actually remaining, and that wall across the bottom here is the Wailing Wall. That if you see pictures of the Jews at Jerusalem standing at the Wailing Wall, that's the one remaining part. But it's not actually part of the temple itself. The prophecy that the stones of the temple will be thrown down is simply the retaining wall on the edge of that is about all that remained. They destroyed the entire area except for this small section of that retaining wall there that the Jews have to show that it still exists. So to move some of those stones was an epic feat. The Jews were then scattered throughout the rest of the world. They didn't stay there. The Romans wouldn't let them stay in the land. They sowed the city of Jerusalem with salt so that no one would ever come back and take that place over, and they turned it over to the locals a bit later. But the Jews themselves were scattered out across the Roman Empire. Now, normally what would happen is this strategy would mean that your nation never got back together. This was a very strategy that had been used by different invading nations in the past. The Assyrians were particularly good at it. They would mix nations together until they're multicultural and scatter them across a particular region in order to make sure that they would never actually regain their footing as a nation again. Now, if that comes back there, or if you want to turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 28, we'll see the promise that he made there about what it would be like when they're scattered. There it is, it's come on the screen. Deuteronomy 28, and thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee. The Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from one end of the earth unto the other, and among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shalt the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. I might just lift this up here and see if that works any better. Seems to be misbehaving on me, so let's see if that part of the equipment is at fault. Now, when the Jews were scattered into the rest of the world, they were not appreciated or liked by other people. And I just want to run through just a couple of quotes which might surprise you about different attitudes towards the Jews in their time of diaspora when they were scattered. The Jews, says Augustine, famous Catholic, the Jews can never understand the scriptures and forever will bear the guilt of the death of Jesus. So that's Augustine's quote. He wasn't very pleased with the Jews, nor was the Pope a bit later. So 1237, Pope Innocent III says, the Jews are guilty of the crucifixion of Christ. It consigns them to perpetual servitude, and like Cain, they are to be wanderers and fugitives. The Jews will not dare to raise their necks, bowed under the yokes of perpetual slavery against the reverence of the Christian faith. So the popes were very determined to keep the Jews in a position of being under the thumb. They were not going to let them become anything more than slaves. And that was their intent through this whole diaspora era, when the Jews did not have a homeland, they did not have a national identity as such, they were scattered and mixed among all the other races, and they were treated like this. Here's Martin Luther. Set Jewish synagogues on fire for the honour of God. God will see we are Christians when we get rid of the Jews. Likewise, houses should be destroyed. They should be put in a stable. They are not heirs of the promises of God and deserve to die. Wow. Yes, Martin Luther, apparently. Go check it out yourself. Everything I say here, by the way, up for your own research. Please go and do your own research on what I have to say. So my point there is not popular, not loved, not cared for, exactly as the quote said. How about this one? George Washington. It is much to be lamented that each state long ago has not hunted them down as pests to society and the greatest enemies we have to the happiness of America. George Washington about the Jews. Likewise, Benjamin Franklin. I fully agree with General Washington and that we must protect this young nation from the insidious influences and impenetration. The menace, gentlemen, is the Jews. So they were not liked in their diaspora. The question is, how do you come back from that? I mean, the nation has not only been scattered, but them as a nation, they're being denigrated across the world by all these different powerful people. Not only that, but they then suffered a string of persecutions. Remember the quote in Deuteronomy? It says, you will have sorrow in those times. You will have terrible times. And in their time away from home, they had the Islamic persecutions. So with the rise of Islam, the Jews were particular targets of the persecutions. There was Christian persecutions. So under the popes and people like Martin Luther, they were triggered to try and persecute them. The Europeans tried to be nice to them, and they tried a process called assimilation. And you can dig into the history books and find the assimilation attempts where they tried to merge the Jews into their country and get rid of their Jewishness, so that they were no longer Jews, they were merged into another country. There was the age of the pogroms, which is quite fearful and horrible piece of history, where the Russians and the Europeans persecuted the Jews that were living inside their country. And of course, probably most famous is the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were killed in Europe. You might say, well, there's other times when plenty more people were killed. Didn't Stalin kill tens of millions? And didn't, the Chinese kill tens of millions? Yes, but this was a deliberate attempt to wipe out a nation and its identity. This was a deliberate attempt to wipe it out. Now, it would have to be the most famous attempt to remove and erase a particular nation. Whatever we think of that idea of the Holocaust, there was definitely a feeling to try and erase the idea of Israel from the earth. How do you come back from that? I mean, your city's gone, you've been scattered across the whole world, the prophecies are against you, and everywhere you go, the Christians, the Muslims, the Europeans, even the Russians, you get as far away up as Russia, nobody loves you. Everybody wants to eradicate your identity from within their nation. And yet the promise of God is that that would only be a temporary thing. This is the amazing thing. Israel, the reason why Israel needs to be something that we pay attention to, and why God's put it here, is to wake people up, to wake the world up to the fact that God exists and he's working the impossible under our very noses. And the existence of the nation of Israel in your newspapers, you will not be able to get away from. You may leave this talk tonight and think, well, that was interesting, but I'd like to forget it. You won't be able to. You'll open your newspapers, you turn on your TV, and you'll see Israel, Israel, Israel. And the reason you'll see it is because God did this on purpose. This is an intentional thing that God's done to have this miraculous nation of Israel in our midst, that it can go through that much of humanity's attempts to wipe it out, and yet it's going to spring back to life. And the restoration of the nation of Israel is perhaps the greatest miracle of our time, and the alarm clock going off. We're told that the restoration of the nation of Israel is the critical sign that the new era is about to commence, that things are about to change very radically. So here we have this quote in Ezekiel here, Ezekiel 11. Therefore say, thus saith the Lord God, although I have cast them far off among the heathen, heathen's word for other nations, and although I have scattered them among the countries, yet will I be to them as a little sanctuary in the countries where they shall come. Therefore say, thus saith the Lord God, I will even gather you from the people and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I'll gather you and I'll give you the land of Israel. So the promise was that they'd be brought back from all those different countries to the land of Israel. Now that's impossible, because the land of Israel had been given to someone else. How do you take a land from someone else and give it to the people of Israel? And not only that, most of the Jews have been encouraged to forget their identity and to hide amongst the populations that they're scattered among. You know, the promise, there's a picture on the left there of a prophecy in Ezekiel 37, which is quite dramatic to read. It describes a valley of bones. And if anyone's seen photographs of the Holocaust and the mass graves then, it looks awfully reminiscent. But the prophecy in Ezekiel 37 is quite bizarre. What it talks about is it says that these bodies will actually come back together. I'll read you a little segment out of verse 12 and verse 21. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, thus saith the Lord God, behold my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves, and I'll bring you into the land of Israel, and say unto you, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, whither they be gone, and I'll gather them on every side and bring them into their own land. And that seems impossible. It's like bringing people back from the dead is the picture that's actually given. The little prophecies are a pictorial representation of something that's about to happen. And the story in Ezekiel 37 of these skeletons being clothed with skin and flesh, standing up as a great army, as if there are people that are dead coming back to life again. It's impossible. People don't come back to life, not from dry bones. And yet in this story they do, and it depicts what was going to happen at the end of the Holocaust and the restoration of the Jews back to the nation, back to their own land. Now, interestingly, I should have put a map of this, but when the world was deciding that there should be a homeland for Israel a little later, they couldn't figure out where to give, and they had all these different locations, including a segment of Australia was actually on offer, interestingly. But there were quite a number of them, because a movement started by this chap, Theodor Herzl, was to demand that the world recognise the Jews and give them a homeland. And this movement called Zionism took hold, and they decided that they would. Zionism demanded Zionism demands a publicly recognised and legally secured homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people. This platform is unchangeable. So Theodor Herzl, around, I think it's around 1890, he said that particular phrase, was a radical person who brought about change, and the change was to give the Jews a homeland that they could go to, and not any homeland, but their old homeland, the homeland of Israel. Now that was also ridiculous. The miracle of Israel being brought back to life was impossible enough, but to give them the land of Israel was ridiculous. It was surrounded by all the people who disliked Israel intensely. So all the different nations that were around that area were not friends of the Zionist hope. And yet, of all these different places around the world, it was settled on to give this particular land. The British stepped in, and this man called Rothschilds Rothschilds helped to achieve what's known as the Balfour Declaration, where the British government said His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment of in Palestine of a national homeland for the Jewish people. And so there was a mandate put out by the British to support this idea and bring the Jews back and allow them to come back. If you read those stories of how they came back, those are miraculous as well. These were Holocaust survivors that came by any means possible, by boats which were completely not seaworthy half the time, and they came back in huge numbers from all across the world to a place that was pretty much desert and surrounded by enemy nations on every side. They tried to do the impossible. And so they were regathered back from all those places, just as the prophecies of God had said. And we're being told that that's in the prophecies as we go through. We only have one night with you tonight, so apologies if I'm summarising to a great degree. But the prophecies about Israel go through and they describe this return of Israel as the key sign before Jesus Christ's return and the dramatic change of world events which turns the world on its head so that Israel will become the head of all the nations and not the tail. So there's going to be a dramatic change with Israel. Israel themselves will not be as they are now. They will not be the same sort of arrogant, self-willed people that they sometimes come across as being, because there will be a change of heart, we're told, in Israel as well. Sadly, we'd love to talk more to you on this, and perhaps you can consider this night to be a bit of a taste test, if you like, and we'd love to tell you more about all of this. But for now, let's keep going with the overview. So they came back from all different nations around the world, and they were opposed by other nations on every side. Their existence in the land of Israel seemed to be a ridiculous idea entirely. I've put up here a list of the different wars that have been in the land of Israel, or involving the land of Israel, since their return and their being declared as a state in 1948. The nation of Israel was established in 1948, and when it was, they instantly went to war, as you can see, with 5 different nations from all different sides. Now, in those early days of the nation of Israel being returned to its land, they were enormously outnumbered. The only weapons they had in some cases were farm implements, farm rifles. And they were not equipped for the war that they actually were thrown into immediately. They didn't have any heavy artillery, any heavy weapons, and they were being attacked by better equipped armies on all sides. And yet, who was attacked? Israel. Who won? Israel. So they were promised that they would come back and be regathered into that nation, and God would give them that land. And so impossibly they won. And they won those first battles. And you can see there's battle after battle going on where all the different nations try to attack them from all different sides. There's a brief list of the different attacks that are going on, have gone on in wars until this one that started, the Israel-Hamas one. And we don't know exactly who's finishing up winning that one, but it looks at the moment like Israel are about to finalise that particular war in Gaza. So you can see that all of those different conflicts, even though they're heavily outnumbered at first and outgunned at first, God had promised it. So if you read those stories about those particular wars, they're frankly miraculous. People don't win wars when you send out 1 tank against 40. Well, that was the odds on the Golan Heights in one of the early wars. You just don't win that sort of war of 1 against 40 in a tank battle. And yet they did. There were all sorts of situations like that through those wars, which we could talk about long into the night if you've got the time. And now we see Israel is still under pressure from all different sides, but there's a difference. Currently, they're being attacked on 6 different fronts. There's 6 different groups at the moment that are putting pressure and attacks on Israel on a regular basis, though perhaps this slide's a little old because Hamas attacked Israel a year ago. They're in not such a strong position to attack Israel at the moment. But these are the different places that are getting attacked from. And you would think that the existence of a nation would be severely stretched to its limits if you had attacks like these. I'll just show you the number of attacks in the last 365 days. Now, this particular statistic was done after the October 7 attacks. So last year, Hamas crossed the border and there was a massive slaughter of Israelis, largest in quite some time. And since then, this is the numbers of the explosive devices of different descriptions that have been landing on Israel from those different sources, mainly rockets from Gaza. So they've had 13,000 rockets from Gaza and about 13,000 from Lebanon. 26,000 rockets coming in. Now, what's the difference between what's gone on here and what's gone on in the previous wars? And I think the difference is that Israel's able to cope with it. And Israel's actually coped with these attacks better than they could have in the early days. They seem to be better equipped. How do they do it? Well, they got their Iron Dome equipment. So they've got their anti-missile missiles that will actually do incredible things. They'll knock another missile out in the air. It's just clever science. So every time the there's an attack from one of their enemy neighbours, Israel can actually respond. The Hamas missiles don't land, but the Israeli ones do. So there's the difference. Fun fact up there, which is probably not fun at all. In the past 6 weeks, Israel has eliminated more terrorists on the US most wanted list than the US has done in the last 20 years. So they're having enormous successes at present in the Middle East. Just a little bit of current events that are going on, we can see a difference in the way Israel's actually working. But back in the early days of their existence, it was a scrambling effort for the mere right to exist. They lost, as a percentage, more soldiers in some of those early wars than Europe did in the Second World War, as a per head population. The losses were intense on the Jewish side. But now there's a different story. They seem to be coping with it quite dramatically. Iran sends in missiles, they kill a donkey and one Palestinian. Israel sends in missiles, and in the last 24 hours, they appear to have knocked out all of their air defense systems, all their S-300 and S-400 missile systems that Iran have got in Russia, and potentially crippled some of their ability to send missiles that can reach Israel. So they're quite capable of doing that, which is technologically an amazing feat. They also dropped some bombs in, I think it was Lebanon and Syria area. One of those bombings that went on in the north of them in the last 24 hours or so, they dropped such a large amount of ordnances that it measured 4.9 on the Richter scale on a local earthquake monitor. So they're seriously doing some damage to their enemies at this time, and putting their enemies, our expression would be, back in their box. Now, we're not saying that the Jews, we're in favour of the Jews and their behaviour, but you can see a difference in the way the Jews are existing now. The Jews existed in a way which was very tenuous to start with in their hold on Israel, and now it's different. Now, this fulfills Bible prophecy as well. The massive chapter where it talks about the change of world events is Ezekiel 38. It talks about another war in Israel that's about to come. Ezekiel 38 describes a war, and this war will involve all nations. All nations will be involved, and this is why you need to know. This is why you need to be here tonight. You need to be warned and prepared. Bible prophecy is not something we suggest can be taken lightly if these things are true, because this war will affect you and your families. It will affect Australia. All nations will be involved in this particular conflict. And this is what the prophecies say is to happen next. When Israel reaches a point where it's dealing differently with its neighbours, then these events of Ezekiel 38 are about to occur. So Ezekiel 38 is a chapter well known, a prophecy well known to Christadelphians. We do lectures just on that subject. We'd love you to come along to one. But I'll briefly encapsulate what it describes. It describes a set of nations coming to invade into Israel. But when they do come, the description of Israel is interesting. I've taken this from the ISV. One of the verses in Ezekiel 38 verse 11 says that the attitude of the nations going to invade Israel is this: I'm going to invade the land comprising of open country that is at rest, its people living confidently, all of whose inhabitants will be securely, with neither fortifications nor bars on their doors. Now that hasn't existed in Israel in recent date. You would definitely need some sort of security system, and I would suggest that perhaps you still need, or many Jews would want to have bars and gates. But that verse describes something which perhaps is starting to occur in this last year or two, is that they are dwelling confidently. When they first entered the land of Israel and took their place in the land of Israel, their existence was tenuous. Now their existence is confidently. Perhaps it's not at the point of not having bars and gates, but even that might be debatable when you've got a missile system that means that nobody can land a hit. So are we at that stage? I can't tell you entirely, but I can tell you that Israel is reaching a new stage, which is that they are dwelling confidently. They are hammering their enemies in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before. So what does this chapter outline? Because this we need to know about. Well, this chapter outlines a new invasion of Israel from a much larger enemy. And Israel will initially lose this particular battle. Here it says in Zechariah chapter 14, another chapter describing this, "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee." This is speaking of Israel. "And I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken." Notice that, all nations. This will be another world war. That's what's being described here, and I'm sorry to break that news to you if you were unaware that the Bible had that prophesied, but you need to know. And the world war will involve the city being taken. And the description there is of the city of Jerusalem. "Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as he fought in the day of battle." Now that is something that the world has not seen before. That describes God himself going out or sending out by his power to fight in that day. "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof towards the east and towards the west, and there will be a very great valley." Now, that's not some prophecy that we can say, well, hypothetically it's about something else. It's very specific. Feet, mountain, splitting of mountain. It's very specific language, and it describes God's representative coming to the Mount of Olives, which is a known location outside Jerusalem, and a great upheaval which causes a valley to be formed in that particular day. So these are dramatic events that are going to involve all nations, and we need to know about them because that's when the alarm clock goes off. This is what the world needs to be to know is about to happen. Okay, let me go back to that Ezekiel 38, and I'll just tell you a little bit more about the build-up that we may or may not see before Christ returns. It says this, "Son of man, set thy face against Gog." Now, in this particular quote here, for the sake of time, I've inserted an explanation. I apologise for not giving you a more detailed explanation. Please give me the opportunity to do so, or come back and join the Christadelphians for a study on Ezekiel 38, because we can explain why these particular areas are listed as they are. Against Gog. Now, Gog describes a leader who is the one at the top of the land of Magog. My apologies for the spelling error. It is the Scythian territory. The chief prince of Rosh, or Russia. Now, the words chief prince got translated into prince, when in actual fact, when you look at the actual wording there, it is a proper name, Ross. "And Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I'm against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I'll turn thee back and put hooks in thy jaws, and will bring thee forth all of thine armies, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia," Persia is the ancient name of Iran, occasionally you still hear it. Ethiopia, well, Ethiopia encompasses, the ancient Ethiopia encompasses Sudan and Ethiopia to a degree. Libya, which still has retained its name, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer, which is the ancient name for some of the French people, and all his bands, the house of Togarmah, which is Armenia and perhaps near Georgia, interestingly having a massive election at the moment, which is they consider to be the most important election in its history, of the North Quarters, and all of his bands and many people with him. I don't expect you to absorb all of that in one shot, nor have I explained it properly. But in order to explain the rest of what we're going to see when the alarm clock goes off, what's going to happen, I'm going to put that on a map so that we can sort of see the size and the description of what those nations are. The land of Magog is the old territory of the Scythians, which encompassed an area between the River Don and the River Danube. And you can see in the top there, that's the area encompassing not only Ukraine, but some of the other nations around it. There's the area of Muscovy, which incorporates Moscow, and the area of Tobolsk, which goes across to the River Tobol. You can see the map is not terribly accurate, and that's intentional. Perhaps this is just an overview of the regions that we're talking about. You notice when you read that quote that all of those groups came with offensive equipment. Horses, swords, offensive equipment was in use. Then there came a group which had defensive, a different grade of equipment, their shields and so forth. And they involved Gomer and Togarmah of the North Quarters. So those different regions here are involved, but on a different footing. They're involved in this invasion force, but involved in a different position. And also, there are some of the other nations here, which are Libya, Ethiopia, which incorporates perhaps some of the area of Sudan, and Persia, which we're hearing about in our news right now, is Iran. So these are the nations which that particular chapter says are going to come down and destroy the city of Jerusalem. They're going to take the nation of Israel and destroy the city of Jerusalem so that the Jews think that now it's all over. And they're going to invade into the Middle East and come against the land of Israel and gather against them when they dwell confidently. But as we said, in that day, that's the day that God will go forth and fight against those nations that are gathered against Jerusalem. Now, I'm sorry if you're threatened and upset by the idea of world war, so am I. It's a terrible thing. We're not wanting to glorify or tell you that that's going to be fantastic, because we know there's going to be terrible loss of life. But you came here tonight to hear about an alarm clock. This is what the alarm is. This is why you should be alarmed, because the world is about to go through a dramatic change. And even if you don't understand Bible prophecy, you're going to start seeing these things playing out in the news more and more. Now, what do you do about it? Well, the news is not bad. The news is actually very good, because this drastic story, we're told Israel will be resurrected, as it were, to prove to us that we should pay attention to Israel. That's what it's for. Why should we pay attention to Israel? So that we're ready when this dramatic invasion comes, because we want to be doing the right thing when that occurs. And then the Bible then goes on to describe a new era, a much better era beyond that. It gives us hope, because if the Bible's been right about its predictions about Israel so far, it's right about its predictions about Israel's future, and they're bright. Once we get through this time frame when the alarm clock goes off and these terrible events are about to occur, beyond that is a better and brighter future, and it involves Israel. Israel will actually be set as one of the leaders. Now, there's this particular story which, again, Christadelphians will spend a whole night talking about, and we'd love to have you for one of those nights. We talk about Daniel chapter 2, which is a picture of all of the world major empires in order. And they all stand up together and unite in this end time and get destroyed by this stone. And the stone smashes that empire image, destroys it, grinds it to powder, and grows to fill the whole earth. And the description is of this new kingdom which is going to be set over all the earth. Here's Daniel chapter 2, which describes this. And I just wanted to tell you that little story so I can grab this particular verse. In the days of those kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou saw the stone cut over the mountain without hands, and break in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, the gold, the symbols of all those different nations of the world, then the great God has made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. The dream is certain, the interpretation is sure. So what we're being told is the nation of Israel is going to grow until it takes over the whole planet. Not as the nation of Israel being the whole planet, but as the empire of Israel, if you like. The British Empire has done something along these lines, where it's the first dominion. It's a phrase we read in our chapter tonight. They were the first dominion of the British Empire, which spread across the globe and spread the British influence. This is different. This is a kingdom that God's going to set up, and it is not going to be destroyed. And it's not going to be given to other people. That quote has never been fulfilled. There has been no kingdom in the history of mankind that has lasted forever and not been given to other people. And certainly not one that's been set up by God and that will consume all other kingdoms. Now, what's it going to be like? Well, it's going to be a new era that is fantastic. Come back with me to the place we started, which is Micah chapter 4. And I'll just finish on this quote because the future is actually bright. I'm sorry if I've given you a few sleepless nights telling you what the future holds in terms of the dramas shortly to unfold as the alarm clock goes off. But the future beyond that is actually bright because God plans not just to make Israel a centre for the world, but a centre for world peace, a centre for world improvement in ways that we have never seen before. I'll put the quote up on screen here. It describes this new era for us in Micah chapter 4. In the last days, it shall come to pass that the Lord, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established on the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow unto it. Now that's an odd expression in itself. The word flow to the top of a mountain. Everything flows down a mountain. The description is that people voluntarily go there. Why? Many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. That's a pseudonym, if you like, for Israel. One of the ancient patriarchs of the nation of Israel was called Jacob, and often the nation of Israel gets called Jacob. Let's go to the house of the God of Israel. He will teach us his ways. We will walk in his paths, for the law shall go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So the city of Jerusalem will be set up as a place for God's law to go out from. Certainly has never been that way in our knowledge in history, that nations will come to Jerusalem to learn how to follow God's instructions. But look at the application of this. And he shall judge among many people, rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up their sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Imagine that. That's the promise that God makes. So if you think that this miracle that God's done with Israel actually happened, have confidence that it'll also fulfill this. He's telling us there'll be an age where war will come to an end and people will take their war equipment and turn it around and make agricultural implements out of it. Because they won't want war anymore. They won't need war anymore. Because why? Because God will rebuke strong nations far off. God's control over the nations will be such that there's no need for implements of war. You don't have to threaten your neighbours to be safe. God will make you safe. That's what it says there. Strong nations will be rebuked, and the average people will get back. Instead of building weapons of war, Adelaide won't be a submarine corps. They'll turn around, they'll be able to worry about agriculture again. This is solving one of the key problems. If you think of one of the critical problems with the world, it is the fact that we are focusing so much money on weapons and war and so little on agriculture and caring for our actual people. Even that one verse tells you so much. But look at this next verse. And they shall sit every man under his own vine, under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make him afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken it. So when God says this is how he wants people to be able to live, they will be able to live this way, that they can sit comfortably under their own vine and fig tree and nobody makes them afraid. You know, that's not the case in so many countries of this world. How many places in this world are there situations where people grow the food and can't afford to eat it because someone else owns it? It's endemic. There's so many places in the world where the poor people who live on the land, grow the food, have to send it out as exports. They can't even put the stuff in their mouth themselves. That's all going to change. Where if you grow it, you own it. If you sit under a fig tree you've planted, you own it. You know, these verses are very simple, but they describe a totally different world from the one that we live in. A world that we can't get back to by anything that the politicians are trying to do these days. There's no way back to this type of world now that the world has built itself into the massive economic system that it is now. So this is the picture we leave before you, friends. And we hope that this serves as a taste for you to actually dig further in your own understanding. What you need to do is you need to come to the Bible and ask this question: what do I need to do? Tonight's been a night for looking at the big picture. It's been looking at the alarm clock of Israel. You've been shown that God can do what he plans with the nation of Israel. He predicted it, he accomplished it. He brought them back from the dead, which is impossible. and brought them back to be a nation in their own land. It's impossible what he's done with Israel so far, and yet he's predicted further things in the future, dramatic things that will affect you and your family. The question is, what are you going to do so that you can find out where you need to be when that happens? How can you be assured that you'll be in the right place so that you can be part of that new world order when it comes? So friends, I hope you can see we're not, as Christadelphians, telling you what we think. We don't have some special inspiration. We're not gifted. We're not got some magic power. We just open this Bible that's available to every one of you. So I encourage you, everything that I've said tonight is open for dispute. Come and ask me. But the dispute context is, what does the Bible say? You want to go home, you want to compare anything? I'll give you my whole set of notes if you want. Go home and compare it with your Bible and ask yourself the question, is that what the Bible's saying? Don't listen to James Jolly. You listen to what the Bible has to say, because James Jolly isn't fantastically magically inspired, but this Bible is proving itself to be right day after day. And if those things are true, then I encourage you strongly to start your research into what the Bible has to say and what you have to do. We as Christadelphians, we feel that the Bible's been fantastic in our lives and has given us direction and guidance in what God wants us to do, and we would be only delighted to help you. We see that as what we're here for. So please reach out and come and ask us so that you can and your family can be in the right place when that alarm clock goes off and the world is drastically changed.